How did the draft riots and enlistment of black soldiers in the summer of 1863 affect Union strength? What actions did General Grant take that led him to overall command of Union forces? What battles was General Sherman fighting in the West to hurt the enemy deep in the Confederacy? For answers to these questions and more Civil War insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, part 4 of a 7-part series on the Civil War, I'm speaking with CMH historian Dr. Matt Margis. Welcome, Matt, and thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lee.
So a little background on Dr. Margis. He works with the U.S. Army Center of Military History as the historian for the Office of the Chief of Staff of the Army. He has been with CMH since 2017. Prior to taking his current position, he worked as a researcher in the Histories Division at CMH. His area of expertise is late 19th century and early 20th century military professionalization. He graduated with a PhD from Iowa State University in 2016. His dissertation, America's Progressive Army, How the National Guard Grew Out of Progressive-Era Reforms, won the Karras Award for Outstanding Dissertation in 2017. That's awesome. Congratulations. He's currently converting his dissertation into a manuscript for publication. Dr. Margis has written articles on African American service during World War I and numerous book reviews. He recently published a chapter on consolidating gains during Operation Market Garden in World War II in an Army University Press volume on large-scale combat operations. That's pretty impressive. A lot of great history work there.
Thank you.
So what am I missing? Tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, Lee, I think you hit most of it. But working in FPS, I also, and working for the Chief of Staff, I also do publication work on the annual Department of the Army Historical Summary that we release every fiscal year. And that just kind of covers the general activities of the Headquarters Department of the Army for that year. And it's a really good CMH publication that kind of covers what's been going on at the headquarters level that a lot of people don't really get to see. Right. And so you can see there's the FY 2020 that just came out. The fiscal year 2021 is currently in review and production, so we hope to have that out. And
so they're about a year after?
They usually, based on the timeline of writing it and getting it through review, it takes about a year to get it. So by the time that the FY 21 comes out, we'll be writing the 22.
Right. Okay, great. And as usual with all our publications, they're available through our website at history.army.mil, including all the Civil War pamphlets, and we'll be talking about that now. So, all right. So at this point, we've been going through all the different years and the battles in the Civil War. So let's start with an overview of the strategic situation at the moment. So the Union just won victories here in July of 1863. At Gettysburg and out west at Vicksburg. So how are things looking for the Union? What's going on?
Looking at just that, things look really good, right? They've just accomplished 2 great feats. Vicksburg, the collapse of that fortification there allowed the U.S. control of Mississippi River, which was key for not only supply but also just for logistical purposes. And of course, Gettysburg it stops the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia's invasion of the North. It's a major turning point in the sense of the Army of the Potomac has finally achieved a complete kind of stunning victory, but it wasn't really a complete victory in the sense that Lee's army was still out there. Lee's army was able to retreat back into Virginia and kind of lick its wounds. And in other places, the problems of the early war are still there in the sense that the U.S. Army still needs to defeat a Confederacy that's spread out across a wide swath of land, and it still has strongholds throughout the South, and it really needs to defeat the South militarily and begin capturing some of these major points. And So even though things are looking good in the summer of 1863, and some have argued that by that point the war was over in the sense that the Confederacy couldn't really stand up militarily for much longer, we know that it does go on another 2 years, and it was far from over.
At the moment, we know that Meade is still in overall command of the Union Army.
Of the Army of the Potomac.
Of the Army of Potomac.
Yes.
And then where's Grant at this time?
So Grant right now, Major General Grant is west. He's with his armies in the Western Theater. He's basically in command of his forces that had just achieved victory at Vicksburg. General Rosecrans, who we'll talk about in a little bit later, he's in command of the Army of the Cumberland, which is moving towards Chickamauga and Chattanooga. So Grant right now is effectively a division commander in the sense that he owns division, meaning Division of the West, not an individual division.
Right, yeah.
So he controls some armies, but he's not in overall command of the U.S. forces yet.
Right. So here we are, 1863, July. Union has some victories. There's some hope, I think, and but it's been 2 years of hard fighting, a lot of casualties, and the Union Army's having trouble getting people to enlist. There's a lot of pushback with the draft. So can you describe what was happening in the summer of 1863, and how did the Army respond to it?
I think we can even look at the current Army today and see some of the problems with the volunteer force, right? It's difficult to maintain volunteerism throughout an entire conflict, especially when casualties are high and at some point the kind of public enthusiasm starts to wane. And that's happening by 1862. And in early 1863, two key developments happen that are going to influence enlistment and the Army. One of them is the official passage of the Emancipation Proclamation that President Lincoln announced in late 1862. That takes effect in 1863. So that's going to open the door for black enlistment, amongst many other things. In terms of bolstering the size of the U.S. Army itself, the U.S. government passes the Enrollment Act in 1863. Now that's about a year later than the Confederacy. The Confederacy actually had a conscription act much earlier in the war, but there was definitely some pushback to the Enrollment Act due to two kind of key reasons. The one being that wealthy citizens could buy their way out of the draft. If they provided $300, they could basically get out of it, or they could pay someone else to take their spot. And there were also some bounties offered, but you could basically pay a substitute. It was often a half and half, where you'd get half, $150 up front, serve in my place, and then if you survive the war, when the war's over, you get the other 150. And so those are,
and that's a lot of money in the day.
It was a pretty substantial sum, and so there were definitely a lot of takers, and there was also the kind of the bounty jumpers, people who they would enlist one place, get a bounty for enlisting, and then desert, maybe change their name, go somewhere else, enlist again, get the bounty, desert, and do this all over. But the Enrollment Act really starts to feed into this concept that.
So you say Enrollment Act, was that considered the draft?
That's the draft law.
Okay.
That was the draft law, yeah. And so it really starts to kind of feed into this idea that anyone who even knows history of American military history late in the 20th century, this idea of the rich man's war, poor man's fight, right? And that was really the flames of that were really stoked in New York City, especially by the Tammany Hall political machine. This was it's run by New York City Democrats. There's of course opposition to the Lincoln administration. They were kind of known for going after immigrants, especially Irish immigrants, and getting them to vote for them, promising them some kind of perks or some kind of some things, but getting them to vote for them, getting them to kind of stand by their position. And they start to become sort of an anti-war faction in New York City. Sort of, they're the ones that are kind of poking and saying, look at who's really benefiting from this, not you, not the Irish immigrant. And they also start to kind of inflame racial tensions, saying, oh, look, not only did the Lincoln administration just push through this Emancipation Act that's now going to bring all these freed slaves into New York, and they're going to be competing for your jobs, and they're going to be competing for your livelihoods, but now they're forcing you to serve in the military, and someone else can just buy their way out of it. And so that really creates a lot of tension in and around the city, especially among the Irish community in New York City. And so the draft riots, the infamous draft riots of mid-July 1863, only a couple weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, really start from that kind of tension that boils over. And on July 13th, a group of basically 500 men led by Engine Company 33. It was a volunteer fire company.
Wow. Were they Irish? Or was it, okay.
Predominantly, yeah. Mm-hmm. And they attack on July 13th the draft station, basically, the place where the draft was being committed or was being carried out, the lottery. And it was a lottery draft. It wasn't everyone. But and there's no militia presence in the city because the New York militia had been pulled away and moved to Pennsylvania to do kind of rear guard duty for the Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg. So it's really only the police department, the municipal police department, and over time, throughout the day, the riot just gets out of hand. The police can't handle it. One of the big atrocities of that first day is the rioters attack the colored orphan asylum, eventually burning it. And by the end of the riot, it really became more of a race riot. 11 blacks were lynched in the course of it. There were about 120 people killed as kind of the more believable estimates. And then at least thousands injured. It's going to kind of ease when Major General John Wool, who is the oldest commander, the oldest officer in the U.S. Army at the time, he was 79 years old by the time of the riots.
And older than Scott, Winfield Scott, I think.
Yes, because Scott was already out. He had already retired, so he's the oldest one left, 79 years old, and he's in command of the Department of the East, not a combatant command, but a kind of administrative command. And he orders the militia to return from Gettysburg to New York, and then he's also going to bring 800 soldiers from around the area into the city, and they begin arriving on the 14th and 15th. And so by the 16th, with the federal troops in place and the militia back, the riot kind of subsides.
So in July? In July. All this is in July. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so the riots were really just centralized in New York. Did it spread to any other cities or towns?
There was opposition to the draft across the U.S., but really it was the New York City ones that are the major riots.
Right, but with General Wool bringing in all these troops back to New York, that's how did that affect the Union Army in Gettysburg or in general?
To be honest, not much. The militia that he pulls back from Gettysburg, they wouldn't have accompanied the Army of the Potomac on any of its operations anyway. They would have probably come back by the end of the month, maybe a little later. And the 800 that he pulls from the Department of the East, again, they weren't actively involved in combat operations. And once the situation subsides, they're able to kind of go back. So it didn't have any manpower impacts on the Army of the Potomac, at least.
Now let's go back a little bit. You were talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, that blacks are now forming units or able to enlist. So let's talk a little bit about that. So with black soldiers now, describe what those units were. Where were they created? Who led them? And what missions were they assigned?
So the first ones are formed in the South. They're known as for example, the one that we consider kind of the quote unquote first is the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers. And those were formed mostly by freed slaves or escaped slaves, more likely at the time. Right. Because the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, only freed slaves in rebellious territory, but since those states didn't acknowledge anymore the federal government's authority, it was really up to the military, in a sense, to actually pass the word. And so a lot of the first few that were formed were in the South, North Carolina especially, and they're formed mostly by escaped slaves. And they're not really given many, I would say, combat roles, right? They're doing a lot of support stuff early. There's another unit formed in Louisiana, but by spring of 1863, the U.S. Army is starting to form volunteer regiments throughout the U.S. territories. Famously, the 54th Massachusetts, for example, is a very famous one. They're recruited locally. Again, most of the people who serve in them, depending on where it is, are either escaped slaves, former slaves living in Northern Territory, or people who were born free. The 54th Massachusetts actually was raised mostly in and around Boston, so a lot of those people who served in that were actually freedmen, a lot of them from birth. Okay. And there was various ways they were raised. Frederick Douglass was a very famous kind of recruiter in the Massachusetts area. His son actually served in the 54th. Oh. And they're commanded by, during the Civil War, white officers. They are, and so they eventually allowed NCOs to come from the ranks, but the officers who led these units were white. And by the end of the war, there were about 175 all-black regiments in what was then known as the U.S. Colored Troops. There were about 175 regiments by the war's end, which is almost close to 180,000 soldiers. And when you look at when the war ends in 1865, if you look at that 180, that's about 1/10 of the entire manpower in the U.S. Army at the time. So they will have a significant impact, and they will serve in a variety of roles. Early on, they're kind of unfortunately mitigated to labor-intensive roles. The idea that a lot of people had was they would serve building the fortifications, doing the manual labor to free up white units to go and fight in a line. That's going to change a little bit later. By the end of 1863, these units are finding themselves doing a wide variety of things, including combat support, a little bit everything.
All right. And then you mentioned the 54th Massachusetts, and so for them, they did get involved in some combat, and it was July of 63. Yes. 1863. Union forces are attacking Fort Wagner, again, in South Carolina. And it's significant because this attack was led by the 54th Massachusetts. So can you describe that battle and the role the 54th played and the overall significance of that?
Sure. So Fort Wagner was located in just south of Charleston Harbor, and it defended Morris Island. And this was part of at the time, the U.S. Army strategy of not only defeating enemy armies, but of course capturing, as I kind of mentioned, these coastal positions, and then having harbors to move inland. So Charleston Harbor was a key kind of strategic point that the U.S. Army is trying to capture, and Fort Wagner is the major impediment to that. Fort Wagner is fairly formidable. It's mostly sand-based walls and parapets, making bombardment much less successful if these projectiles are landing in dense sand. They're not doing a lot of damage. So it's a very fordable position. There's an attempt to capture it earlier in July of 1863. That fails. So the kind of famous Battle of Fort Wagner, the one that a lot of people think about, on 18 July 1863, is actually the second attempt that month. So this is, again, you think of timing, this is 2 days after the end of the draft riots, right? Yeah. It's only a couple weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg. And yes, as you mentioned, the 54th Massachusetts, commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, that is the unit that is going to lead the assault. It's kind of immortalized in the movie Glory. I think a lot of people have probably seen the film.
Right, Matthew Broderick, yeah.
Yeah, and there's some issues with the way the battle is portrayed in the film, particularly that it kind of makes it look like the 54th was on its own. And while it spearheaded the attack, it was supported by, there were 9 regiments in total. Effectively, there were 2 brigades, that were involved. The 1st Brigade was commanded by General George Crockett Strong, and that's the brigade that included the 54th. The other brigade was commanded by Colonel Haldeman Putnam, and that includes the 7th New Hampshire and 6th, 2nd Ohio, 6th, 7th Ohio. So there's and a few others. So these are it's a massive attack. It's 2 brigades, as I said, about 9 regiments that are going in. But the 54th is kind of in the center. They're leading the assault. And in order to capture the fort, it's sort of a joint operation as well. There's a naval component to this. There are Monitor class naval ships that are attempting to bombard the fort from the sea, and that is largely ineffective. I kind of mentioned before that the design of the fort makes kind of the sea bombardment kind of weak. And part of another problem was it was very difficult to get land-based artillery into a good position to attack the fort because of the approach, the sandy beaches, everything else. So it's really the Navy is providing the artillery support here. In order for the attack to work, the 54th actually needs to advance beyond a defensive position and then kind of pivot and work its way in. And so there's 9 regiments. They're all moving in different directions. They're all trying to kind of converge from different points. And what's going to end up happening is they attack at dusk, and as they get within a few hundred yards, they come under heavy fire. So there's a kind of a period where they basically say, okay, we're going to have to cross over a moat, and then we're going to wait till darkness sets in and make our final assault. Then, which they didn't have to wait too long, but when they finally do make the assault, they get within a few hundred yards. They actually get across onto one of the parapets, and that's just when they're basically the attack is repulsed. The 54th is going to suffer. Out of 600 men in the regiment, they're going to suffer about 270 casualties. So that's of course killed, wounded, and missing, including Colonel Shaw, who's killed in the attack. Frederick Douglass's son, who I mentioned, he survives. And it's kind of portrayed again in the film as though they were completely wiped out. They weren't, but they did suffer heavy casualties, and they weren't the only ones. In the total attack that day, there were over 1,500 combined U.S. Army casualties, and as I mentioned, 270 from that regiment alone. Of the regiments that were involved, though, the 54th suffered percentage-wise the worst of it. And that's basically kind of how the Battle of Fort Wagner ended. After the next couple days, the U.S. Army realizes they're not going to capture the fort this way. They retreat, and in the next few months, they lay siege. And by September of 1863, the Confederate defenders of the fort just decide to evacuate.
Oh, okay. So eventually, it goes into Union hands.
It does. It falls and kind of literally falls. It's no longer the original fort. Kind of just eventually.
But it's no longer an impediment to the Union goals.
And by that point, by September of 1863, the U.S. has made some other inroads too. So kind of holding out on Morris Island, holding out in that position, no longer was tenable for the Confederacy. So it just kind of falls away.
And the success, or I should say, the actions of the 54th, did that help change people's view of the black soldiers in that time?
It certainly did for the Army. It showcased to Army commanders that, yes, these soldiers could fight. That there was, of course, racism at the time made a lot of people think that black people were just inherently incapable. This showed that was not the case, and that they were just as capable as white soldiers. And there will be some heroics that come out of it. William Carney is one of the, I don't want to say first, because he will receive his Medal of Honor later in life, but it's the earliest action of a in the United States military of a black man receiving the Medal of Honor. And so there's a lot of heroics that take place, and of course the unit will gain fame. And then as I mentioned earlier, as the war goes on, the kind of the hesitancy to use black soldiers in combat. It's still there, but it wanes a bit.
Right.
But it's certainly still there.
All right. Well, let's shift focus now out west. So talk about the Battle of Chickamauga. Am I pronouncing that right? Chickamauga. And that took place in September of '63. So talk about the two sides, who was in charge, and what happened.
Yeah, so at that time, at Chickamauga, General Braxton Bragg is in charge of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. And the U.S. Army of the Cumberland is under command of Major General William S. Rosecrans. And he manages to capture Chattanooga without much of a fight, and then proceeds to move into Georgia. And his goal is to push from Chattanooga, Tennessee, into Georgia and eventually make inroads there. His army is arrayed in a way that it's almost a long line. Rosecrans himself is in I guess you could call it the front of that line, which in effect is the left flank of, if you were to look at a map and you'd sort of see the army stretched out, he's in the front, but if you were to look at it from the side, that would be the left flank in a sense. And General Bragg wants to basically catch them as they move, and he wants to attack them in piecemeal. So what he does is he is going to, in September, attack the left flank of this moving column. And it's initially kind of repulsed. Bragg's initial attack, it catches the U.S. troops a little bit off guard, but they're able to retreat a bit, reform a good line. And if you were to look at it in the military situation, it would look pretty straightforward. There were two lines. Rosecrans, though, is convinced that there's a gap in the line. So he's at this point, again, he's on what would be the left flank.
In his own line?
In his own line, okay. Yeah. So he believes that there's a gap sort of to the right. So he is going to rearrange his force and move soldiers to fill that gap. Well, there wasn't a gap. What he actually does is creates a gap.
Oh, no.
So he basically gave Bragg what Bragg needed. Bragg then attacks, and he exploits the now created gap, forcing kind of 2/3 of Rosecrans' army to begin to retreat. It's the one holdout is the center, and this is where Major General George Thomas, his corps is holding out in the center, and they're going to basically withstand the assault. The problem with that is it creates a salient, effectively a bubble, as the two left and right keep falling back. Thomas kind of stays firm. This is where he'll earn the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga. But it allows him to be attacked then from all sides, and he eventually has to fall back as well. What that does, though, is Thomas's stand gives the U.S. Army forces enough time to basically fall back in sort of a more what's the word I'm thinking of? Not
it's like a standard formation.
Just not kind of fall back, kind of organized.
Yeah, right.
And they will fall back into Chattanooga, and of course, again, the stand also helps to wear down the Confederate soldiers, so they're not able to kind of give the final assault that Bragg was hoping for, and instead they're going to resort to a siege. So now Rosecrans and his army is held up in Chattanooga, and the Confederates are surrounding them on three sides from heights, particularly Missionary Ridge, Lookout Mountain. Very formidable, and they are able to cut off Rosecrans from the outside. He kind of falls apart there. President Lincoln will basically say that he was acting like a duck hit on the head. Basically, the idea that some have put forward is that he was suffering from some sort of PTSD or shell shock or just complete loss of confidence. Luckily for the U.S. forces there, help was on the way. General Grant had already dispatched one of his chief and most trusted subordinates, William Sherman, who had his army of the Tennessee. he had already dispatched him to Chattanooga to attempt to reinforce Rosecrans. And Secretary of War Edwin Stanton had detached Major General Joseph Hooker's corps from the Army of the Potomac earlier to move out that way. And he has about 20,000 soldiers with him, and he's also moving in the direction of Chattanooga. So there is help on the way, but if you looked at the situation in late September 1862, it doesn't really look good.
63,
excuse me, 63, yeah. On September 29th, that is when Edwin Stanton sends Grant. He's created this new Department of the Mississippi, and he sends Grant, and he says, you are now in command of this entire department, which, of course, is going to include Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland. So Grant is going to go to Chattanooga. He takes overall command. He replaces Rosecrans with George Thomas, the old Rock of Chickamauga, is now in command of the Army of the Cumberland. And so he has effectively, under his command now at Chattanooga, you could call it three armies. He has Sherman's Army of the Tennessee, which had come in. He has now Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, and he has Joseph Hooker's 20,000 soldiers who are also en route, who are also there.
So now in command, what's Grant's strategy? What's his next plan?
So his first kind of point is to get supplies in. They're being starved out. He needs food. He needs food for his soldiers and for their animals. So he looks to Brigadier General William F., known as Baldy Smith. Smith was a West Point graduate. He kind of career soldier. Graduated fourth in his class in 1841. Engineer by trade, or at least by military trade, and he's the chief engineer of what was the Army of the Cumberland, of the Army of the Cumberland, but now under Grant's command. And he proposes this concept of we can open supplies from a different angle, and what it's going to need is if we can basically move some soldiers out of Chattanooga and get on one side of the river, cross over the other, because Hooker's soldiers are coming from that direction. Hooker's two corps are coming from that direction. We can link up with them and kind of create, and then kind of, rather than trying to get supplies in the more conventional way, which is coming under attack by the Confederates who have cut rail lines and everything else, we can bring them in from effectively the south in this sense, because it's coming from Joseph Hooker's line. So, and this is a great, complete success. They They open this line up. There's a few kind of short, small battles, some skirmishes, but they're able to open the line. And so basically by October, while the Confederates still have the high ground and they still have these imposing positions, they're no longer starving the U.S. troops out. And so they're able to resupply. And Grant has this intention of breaking out, and not only, and he doesn't want to retreat from Chattanooga. He wants to break out and push the Confederates back into Georgia. The Confederate Army is reinforced as well. The Confederate government had dispatched from the Army of Northern Virginia James Longstreet's corps to support Braxton Bragg. Bragg and Longstreet hate each other, is putting it mildly, I guess. They really do not get along. And there's this debate about who's really in command. And so, to not get into all the detail, Longstreet leaves. Bragg
with his army,
with his army, but he goes towards Nashville, where General U.S. Army General Ambrose Burnside has his army there. And the idea is that if the thinking goes that if he dispatches Longstreet, if Bragg sends Longstreet to attack Nashville, that might force Grant to abandon Chattanooga, or it could, if they capture Nashville, then that would completely change the situation. That, of course, just does not work. It completely fails. But excuse me, Knoxville, not Nashville. Sorry, Knoxville, Tennessee.
Okay.
And in any event, it doesn't work. It fails. But Bragg is not too upset about that, because he's now rid himself of what he sees as an impediment in James Longstreet. The end of November, November 24th and 25th is when Grant makes his move. And he envisions sort of a dual flanking attack with Sherman's army attacking on what would be the Confederate left at Missionary Ridge and Hooker's corps attacking on Lookout Mountain. And there's some logistical problems. Effectively, Sherman's soldiers attack the wrong hill. Their maps weren't very accurate, and they end up attacking a hill that's undefended, and realize that's not the right ridge.
Right.
And so that kind of delays things a little bit, at least on Sherman's side. But Hooker actually achieves some great success in moving his soldiers up, and what was supposed to be kind of a diversionary tactic on Lookout Mountain actually becomes a great success story for the Army at the time. They forced the Confederate defenders off, and now they control the highest point. On the 25th, Grant pushes the battle more. He tells Sherman to continue the attack. Sherman gets bogged down. It's very difficult taking Missionary Ridge. He's not moving as quickly he's not advancing as quickly as he'd hoped. So Grant orders General Thomas and his army in the center of the Cumberland in the center to begin attacking the Confederate center at the base of the ridge. And there's effectively Confederate entrenchments there and then artillery on the top of the ridge. What ends up happening is Thomas's troops advance pretty successfully, and they capture these trenches and force the Confederates up. And then they realize, of their own sort of accord, we're in a really bad position now because the Confederate artillery can just shoot down on us. So kind of without orders from Thomas, they continue their advance because they realize there's two things we can do. We can stay here and get bombarded by this artillery, pummeled, or we can retreat back, and why would we have fought for this ground if we're just going to retreat back? So they continue the fight up, and Grant immediately is sort of like, what are they doing? I didn't order that. And Thomas is like, I didn't order it either. But they advance with just
vigor.
And they manage to get up, and they divide the Confederate defenders in two. They capture the center. That's going to, of course, shift things, which is going to allow Sherman's army to kind of come through. And then on November 26th, Bragg retreats from Chattanooga, and it's a resounding victory for Grant and Sherman and Thomas. It's not without its costs, though. The U.S. is going to suffer about 5,800 casualties, about 750 killed, 4,700 or so wounded. That's out of about 56,000 engaged. The Confederate casualties are higher. They're about 6,600, with about 360 killed and about 2,100 or so wounded. And that's out of about 44,000 engaged. So it's a costly defeat for Braxton Bragg's army, and it's a great victory for Grant's army. The issue is going to be similar to what Meade faced in Gettysburg as the follow-up. And it's after a battle like that, after this long slog, and as the enemy is retreating, how vigorously do you pursue them? And just for the sake of reality, it's like you can't, you need time to regroup. And Grant finds that out. There's a pursuit, but it's not real. They chase basically Bragg deeper into Georgia, but there's not that great follow-up where they destroy the Bragg will be replaced command. He will lose his command after this, but if you looked at the strategic situation, Chattanooga, great victory for the U.S. Army, but again, by November of 1863, by December of 1863, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Right, because Chattanooga is a major transportation hub.
It is, and it was known as basically the gateway to the South. It's a major transportation hub, rivers, rail lines, and so it's going to become a major base of operations that the U.S. Army is going to use to launch its subsequent invasions of the South, because that's a good place where they can stockpile, prepare, move people, material, food, everything in there, and then launch operations from there.
Yeah. What happened to Longstreet?
So Longstreet's going to eventually find his way back to the Army of Northern Virginia. He will return, which is kind of the intention the entire time.
Oh.
It was never that he was going to stay with the Army of Tennessee. He was going to return to the Army of Northern Virginia. He was just kind of sent as a way to help. Bragg, of course, takes this as a slight against him. But yeah, by the time 1864 rolls around, Longstreet is back with the Army of Northern Virginia as General Lee's kind of right-hand man.
So now, after the success at Chattanooga, Lincoln, as he has this revolving door of commanders of the Union, he makes another overall change in Union command. So who does he put in, and how does it work out?
So, yeah, it's up to this point, Lincoln's major frustration has been with Army commanders. Going from McClellan through, there was McClellan, then there was Burnside, then there was Hooker, McClellan. I mean, it kept going around
right.
until finally Meade. But these were Army commanders, right? These are commanders of the Army of the Potomac. And then there were some similar reshufflings with armies in the West. General Henry Halleck was in charge for a while there, replaced by Grant, then Halleck. And part of this stemmed from the actual Army organization at the time, what was allowed congressionally, and there wasn't an authorization for a general officer position above Major General. And if you kind of think about what that means, is that a lot of these commanders, whether they're Army commanders, division commanders, corps commanders, they all carry the same rank. And sometimes we're talking days or two where that separates one from the other.
Right.
And so there's a natural inclination there for some combativeness.
Yeah.
Earlier in the war, Lincoln had attempted to make George McClellan overall commander of all the U.S. Army. He stayed in the East, and he didn't really have a lot of care or concerns about the Western theater. After the 7 days battles in Richmond, he changes that. What he does with General Grant is he says, "I'm going to nominate you for a 3rd star, and I'm going to put you in command as General-in-Chief of the Army." So in control of the entire U.S. Army. General Halleck earlier had kind of been promoted to a version of Chief of Staff, but really only had administrative control. This puts General Grant in command of the entire U.S. Army. He chooses to stay in the East and oversee the Army of the Potomac, but he is now devising strategy, he's now devising plans, and he is now overall commander.
And you mentioned now, with his absence from the West, he puts, is it Sherman, right? Yes. He puts Sherman in charge there.
He's going to put Sherman in charge of the Western armies, and so he's sort of his main subordinate, his number 2. And as I kind of mentioned, he's going to choose to accompany the Army of the Potomac, but he leaves the Army commanders in command. So George Meade remains in command of the Army of the Potomac.
Oh.
Grant is just along with them.
But he's devising the overall strategy for the entire Union Army, not just the Potomac.
Right. Yeah, and he's going to have some meetings with Sherman and with President Lincoln, and they're going to kind of come up with, here's our approach to finally ending this thing.
Matt, is there anything else that you want to cover that we didn't bring up?
I think that's about it, I think, for
all right, well, good. Then, because now we get to my favorite part. We're going to talk about some Whoa trivia. So, a little piece of exciting, interesting trivia about this time period. So do you have anything to share?
I was trying to think of a good one, and I was just, for some reason, Army medical stuff has been in my head recently. So I don't know if it's exciting or fun, but I think it's very interesting, is one of the big misconceptions about Civil War medicine and Civil War medical treatment is this idea that, the soldiers, if you're wounded at all, these butcher doctors are going to come cut amputate your limb off, and there's no anesthesia, everything like that. And that's really not true. Actually, about 95% of Civil War operations were conducted with some sort of anesthesia, whether it was usually ether, but so the kind of
or some rum or whiskey.
Actually, rum and whiskey was either given after, but it really wasn't the main one. It was usually ether or chloroform.
Okay.
And so the Hollywood image of the bite the bullet and the awake amputation just really isn't accurate. And really these doctors had come to the reason they did amputation so freely was not because they didn't know any better. It was because they understood that these soft lead bullets would shatter bone and lead to a lot of subsequent infections. So the best way to actually save a life and prevent subsequent infection was if someone was shot in a limb, usually amputation. But there's just a lot of misconceptions out there.
Yeah, I'm glad you cleared that up because there, from what a lot of people know today, from movies, TV, those images are out there. Yeah, and they make a big deal about that. What's interesting too. So no, I think that's a great point, and I'm glad we were able to clear that up. But in a lot of our Army museums, one of the things I find fascinating are the medical kits throughout the years. But to see, I know in our new National Museum of the U.S. Army, they have a great display of the medical kits from each era. But the Civil War one, it's just scary to look at.
Yeah, with the bone saw and all that.
So pretty interesting. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for your discussion and insights today about the Civil War years of 1863 and 1864. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Civil War and learn more about Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And we have a great pamphlet series called the U.S. Army Campaigns of the Civil War. They are available as free PDF downloads, so check them out. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please join us every week on this podcast for more in-depth discussions as we cover topics from all eras of the U.S. Army history. Thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.